Welcome to the University of California, San Francisco Sports Medicine Podcast, featuring Dr. Nira Fundia, Dr. Brian Feeley, and Dr. Drew Lansdown, discussing hot topics in sports medicine and society. We hope you enjoy our podcast and look forward to hearing from you.
Today on our 6 to 8 Weeks podcast, we're going to talk about the NFL Draft and the NFL Combine with my colleague Drew Lansdown, a sports medicine surgeon and Green Bay Packers fan. We think about the NFL Combine as a time to check stats, how fast people run the 40, how strong they are benching 225 pounds, how quick they are on the shuttle run. But it really had humble beginnings as essentially a medical check. The Combine started in 1982 by the National Football Scouting Group in Tampa, Florida. The camp welcomed about 160 players, and 16 clubs that were members of this scouting group acquired medical information on the prospects. Well, this invitational camp was designed to be a single location. Not every team went at first. And in fact, the next 3 years, there were multiple camps. And it wasn't until 1985 where the 3 camps merged and the NFL chose to have this run as a centralized event. It benefited teams mainly by allowing them to collect a more in-depth medical, physical, and psychological profile on these players, especially in the pre-internet period of time where it was much harder to get information, especially on these old high school and maybe early college injuries. So we will talk today a little bit about how this information is disseminated among clubs, and then go through some common injuries that are seen in college football and whether your team should be worried about future injury risk with the draft coming up. All right, welcome, Drew. I know you're a Green Bay fan and you're eagerly anticipating the Aaron Rodgers to New York Jets or San Francisco 49ers decision. Are you going to change allegiances when Aaron Rodgers is no longer with the Packers?
No, I'll definitely continue to be a Packer fan. And, we had Brett Favre and then Rodgers, and maybe Jordan Love will continue the tradition, but it'll be strange without Rodgers for sure. But, it seems like time has come for some change there. Brian, this week, the NFL draft starts on Thursday, and so a lot of interest there. And I think one of the things that always comes up is the how injuries impact prospects and their future in the NFL. And I think you had some really interesting experience. Previously, you helped take care of the Giants.
As part of my fellowship at Hospital for Special Surgery, I was fortunate enough to take care of the Giants. The wonderful thing about that year was we won the Super Bowl. That was the first time we beat the New England Patriots. And then we got to go to the Combine. And as we talked about a little bit in the introduction, the Combine is actually a medical event that expanded, not the other way around. And if you think back to the 80s when this started, there was very little data. And for full disclosure, I'm talking 2007, 2008. I was not a physician in the 80s. But you think about the 80s and 90s, before there really was the internet, it was really hard to get information on these players, their injury history, et cetera. So what the Combine started as was this ability to collect medical information, disseminated among teams, and really make everything more better for the teams, better for the players. You didn't have to travel. You didn't have to get x-rays 32 different times or 15 different times. Especially as our diagnoses got more advanced and our ability to get MRIs, post-op CTs, this really centralized the whole system. In general, it's not a competitive event between the teams. There may be some friendly rivalries between medical groups, but it really is a sharing of information. The players will pass through groups of teams of 4. Literally 4 teams will be together at a table. They'll interview, they'll ask questions about injury history. They may go through an exam, and then any previous imaging is usually brought in and gone over. So it really is a collaborative event. And I think it's really important in terms of figuring out which injuries are going to be a problem down the line and which injuries are really no big deal, because up to that point, nobody's really seen this information about the players. That all they've really seen is kind of what the public sees. So-and-so had an MCL sprain. Well, how bad was it? You don't know until you feel that knee. So Drew, I wanted to go through, since the draft is coming up, neither of our teams have a top 10 draft pick until the Packers mortgage their future. How important do you think injury history is when looking at early draft picks?
Yeah, I think there are some injuries where it will, definitely impact, potential future productivity. And then, a lot of injuries are just part of playing football, playing a contact sport. And, so if you've played high school, college, like there's going to be some injuries, like getting through all that unscathed is really unlikely. And so it's, I think a lot of it's like figuring out which ones are consequential and then which ones are just kind of routine recoverable and then won't really impact long-term success. And so I think for most, they've probably missed a few games here and there, even up to a year, things like that, and then still probably wouldn't raise too many red flags about what the future looks like.
So before we kind of run the list of injuries and potential players that have had these injuries, can you think of the last time a top 10 draft pick had a really serious injury history? Somebody who like was so good they ignored the fact that they had an injury history.
Well, I think Nick Bosa.
What?
He had a pretty strong injury history, right?
No, he is a physical specimen.
Yeah, well, I mean, he clearly is, but and then I think his talent and it clearly outweighed any prior injuries in his case. But I think he had missed some games in college and certainly had some concerns, but like clearly it was a great pick and seems to be on track for a historic career.
Yeah, I've noticed in the Drew Lansdown trade generator, every time you decide you are going to get rid of Rodgers to the Niners, it's Nick Bosa, Deebo Samuel, 3 first-round draft picks for Aaron Rodgers.
That sounds fair. Yeah.
Not how it works.
Yeah.
Yeah, the one I always go back to is, even though it's a little bit older now, is Sam Bradford. And the idea was he had that throwing shoulder injury, he had that AC separation. Is he going to play in the NFL? And realistically, I think he did pretty well. And his injury subsequently really didn't have much to do with that injury. Like he still could throw the ball well. I don't think that injury stopped him from playing, but he was definitely somebody that there was a lot of talk about whether or not he should be drafted. He ended up being the first overall draft pick in 2010. Now, what about the other way around? Can you think of a player that had a serious history of injury in college? Their draft stock really dipped, and then they actually did great.
Let's see. Well, I mean, one that draft stock dipped and then never really performed. So like I remember Jalen Smith, linebacker, and had like knee dislocation, multi-leg knee, and then he I think was projected to be in the first round before that, and looked like a great player, and then just never was quite the same after that. And then I think somebody like Marcus Lattimore, he was another one that seemed to just be on this like ascending trajectory, and then a huge catastrophic knee injury, and still played, but just not quite the same.
Yeah, I think the knee dislocations are really something that I mean we can talk about, but those are ones that I really think are career changing, and whether that's in the NFL with Navarro Bowman, Lattimore, the only one that I can really think of that was serious knee dislocation, came back and actually did pretty well, is Willis McGahee.
Yeah.
Then when I think about it, how good would he have been out that knee dislocation? The one that I remember, sadly, because he showed up so much and in so many commercials, is Rob Gronkowski, who had a back injury. Yeah, I believe he had surgery, but he really dipped a fair amount. And then when he came back, there was a lot of questions about his back. And sure, he did have back issues while he played in the NFL, but I don't think you could say that, gosh, his career was limited. And I'm sure every team that passed on him at least once wished they had Gronkowski on their team.
Yeah, totally. And I think he's another one where, I mean, I think his talent was probably so high, and even if he was a little limited by it, he clearly overcame it and performed to like a pretty high level.
Yeah, totally. I mean, he's not the best. Kittle is the best, going back Brent Jones, but he had an okay career. So I wanted to go through a couple common injuries that we see, and we can talk a little bit about who in the draft has these injuries and whether or not you would be a little bit concerned, really concerned, or it raises major red flags. And I think the one that's most interesting to talk about is an ACL injury, and Hendon Hooker, the quarterback for Tennessee. So when you hear somebody's had an ACL injury their senior year or their final year, How concerned are you about their long-term ability to play in the NFL? And are there any things within that ACL injury that you think about that would change that prognosis?
Yeah, and ACL injuries, they're still a big injury to the knee, and it's not like absolutely guaranteed that people will get back to play, back to prior performance. There is still some variability, but for a lot of like isolated ACL injuries, we almost expect those players to come back. And I think we start getting more concerned when there's something like a meniscus tear, and then some meniscus tears are worse than others, and some can be harder to heal, harder to fully recover from. And then if there's like an associated ligament injury as well, those just get more complicated, add another layer of difficulty, and maybe harder to recover from. But if it's isolated ACL, I think you'd feel pretty good about chances of returning. Then you start adding on those other things, and it just raises your concern a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that difference between an ACL injury versus an ACL plus something else, not even a multi-leg, is really important.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that's really important is whether or not there's a meniscus injury versus an ACL injury. And there was a study that came out, gosh, it's probably been a decade now, when they looked at career trajectories in the NFL when people had a meniscus injury versus an ACL. And athletes actually did better with the ACL. And I think the problem is especially if you've had 2-3 meniscus surgeries headed into an NFL career, you're missing a fair amount of your meniscus, or there's a decent risk that you're going to miss a fair amount of your meniscus. And then you're going to end up potentially with developing more loads on the knee and developing early arthritis or pain and swelling. And so I think actually, even though we talk about meniscus injuries being less of a big deal in terms of time lost, I think it's really important in terms of looking at that career length that a meniscus injury might be a bigger deal.
Yeah.
Okay, so what about fractures? So Keyshawn Boots, the LSU receiver, I believe had an ankle fracture. Is this something you worry about? Are there long-term problems? And they said he had 2 surgeries, one for the first surgery, but then he had a non-union where the bone didn't heal quite right, and then had a second surgery. Would you drop him off the Packers draft board?
Well, I think, with anything like that, you really need to see where the fracture is. There are a lot of ankle fractures that heal really well. And then once you're recovered, you're in pretty good shape going forward. And then there's some, especially anything that enters into the joint, that has more ligament damage, more potential for instability. All of that's associated with higher risk of arthritis. And especially in the short term for somebody who's, high impact. So, those types of injuries, that's where you get concerned. Like, is that going to get really stiff? Is it going to swell and be painful all the time? And then, now you go from, being this explosive athlete to like not being able to run. So that's one where like, I think you'd really need to see where it is. And then, unfortunately those predictions are never perfect, but can have some idea about like that risk going forward. What do you think?
Yeah, I think if it's well healed, he's got good range of motion and nothing looks bad. And that's why it's so important to be able to have seen those x-rays.
Yeah.
I think probably fine. And a vast majority of fractures are ones that people heal up from just fine. So I would be mildly worried, but it would totally depend on the x-rays. And frankly, even if you were in the situation where you got an x-ray and it didn't look like it had healed kind of before he got to that second x-ray, I still think it's treatable, but realistically, if you're spending a high draft pick on it, he's probably going to drop so that they can do the surgery, keep him out. But my guess is it looks like he's playing fine, feels fine. And unless there's something surprising, he won't really drop. Now, the other one that comes up a lot, because it's actually the most common injury in the NFL, and I don't know the college stats, but it's probably pretty similar, is a hamstring strain. And Jackson Smith-Njigba has had a hamstring strain over the last year. He didn't play as much as people thought in 2022. So as a wide receiver, how much would this worry you for somebody that has the need for explosive ability? Does that worry you? Or do you think this is something that not going to class would be a problem that they could just train through?
Yeah, I think it probably wouldn't worry me too much. Hamstring strains are so common, and usually it's something that people can recover very well from. I think, in college, there's always that question, especially with like, potential high level draft pick. Are they just erring on the side of caution? Like, if there's the tiniest bit of pain, they're not risking things and, going back too early, um, for a team that, probably doesn't need an extra high level receiver. But yeah, I think that would be one that, as long as, he's running well at this point and strength looks good and everything else, like it's probably easy to look past for most.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I think it's so hard for these high level players now. They will consider their pro prospects. Absolutely. They totally should. So were they held out? Was it a severe injury, but it's their only one? I do get a little bit concerned about people that have had the same injury over and over and over. Yeah. That's obviously not the case for this player, but when they've had the same thing happen 2, 3, 4 times and it's limiting them multiple years, then I would be a little bit more concerned. I think the ones that I think are really interesting because that we treat them very differently are things in the neck and back. So my general sense is that unless it's a devastating lumbar spine injury, lumbar spine and low back problems are pretty common in athletes, especially on the offense and defensive line. When you're in that hyper extension position, I'm not too worried if they've had some low back problems. Even if they've needed to have a surgery at some point, that's not concerning. What do you think about a player that's had multiple stingers or has had multiple neck problems?
I think that gets really concerning. And, especially when you're advising the athlete, because when you've had multiple recurrent issues with, anything in the cervical spine, I think then you're talking about potential risk for paralysis even. And so those are ones where I think it's, kind of on us at times to advise them like, hey, this like contact sport is probably not the right thing. And that's a hard conversation, but, definitely don't want to put anybody at risk for huge catastrophic injury.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely a big deal. I think for the lumbar spine, the one that comes up in the draft is Dalton Kincaid. He had a lumbar spine fracture that there are these little projections that come off the spine that are pretty commonly injured, whether it's your spinous process, which is the thing if you push on your back, you feel, or the transverse process that go out to the outside. And we commonly see these in collision and contact athletes, and these will tend to heal. There's not going to be any structural issues. The last one I wanted to ask you about is concussions. If a player had a history of multiple concussions, would that change your thoughts about drafting that player?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would, and it probably should. And, that's another one where I think it's also on us to have those conversations with the player themselves to, have them understand like what kind of risk they're taking on. And I think a lot of it is, number of concussions, severity, what their recovery has looked like, kind of what it's taken to get to that point. Because the impact's only going to get worse and it's only going to get higher, more frequent. And, so if they're already coming in with a, strong history of head trauma, that would definitely give me pause, both for the team and then also in talking to the player about best options for them.
Yeah, I think it's something we don't really understand. It's really tough because you don't want to necessarily limit their options, but what's probably best for a player that's had multiple concussions. I mean, health-wise, we know it's best if you've had multiple concussions, you shouldn't be hit in the head more.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think a lot of players will feel like it's worth the risk to play in the NFL or at least give it a go. And I don't think we have the data yet to say this is what happens if you've had 1 concussion, 2 concussions, 5 concussions in terms of playing time, how well you play. We know the downstream risks of those concussions, but players do also in theory, get that information.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for that interesting discussion. I'm looking forward to the draft coming up this week, even though the Niners don't draft until the 3rd round. Hopefully we see some interesting trades in the 1st round. I have a feeling that both of our teams are going to be looking for different quarterbacks or utilizing different quarterbacks on our roster.
I think so. I think it'll be a pretty interesting week on both ends.